Hi, everyone. Welcome to SAIS Rethinking Iran's initiative. And welcome to everyone today. We're going to have a conversation about a new report that's come out under our Iran Under Sanctions series, which today's conversation looks at the impact of economic sanctions on Iran's publishing industry. But before I get into today's talk, again, I'd like to welcome everyone to SAIS's Rethinking Iran initiative. I'm Nargis Bajogli, an assistant professor here at SAIS, and I run this initiative along with my colleague, Professor Vadi Nas. So today we're really excited to have Dr. Hosna Sheikholeslami with us today, who I think is one of the most exciting anthropologists and ethnographers doing work on contemporary Iran. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at Denison University. She's a cultural anthropologist whose research interests include political and economic anthropology, the anthropology of knowledge, and translation. Dr. Sheikholeslami is currently completing her first book manuscript, which I'm really excited about, tentatively entitled Translating Imaginaries, the Infrastructure and Politics of Publishing in the Human Sciences in Iran. It's based on 2 years of fieldwork in Tehran, and the manuscript examines how and why knowledge travels transnationally. Her dissertation, which the manuscript is based on, won multiple awards, including the Mehtad Mashayekhi Dissertation Award from the Association of Iranian Studies and the Malcolm H. Kurd Dissertation Award in the Social Sciences from the Middle East Studies Association in 2018. Her research has been supported by the Werner Gren Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, and the National Science Foundation. So welcome, Hosna.
Thank you so much for having me and for making this report possible, but also the entire initiative is such an exciting resource to have. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I'm really glad we're able to get you on here. So, in this Iran Under Sanctions series where we've brought on scholars from around the world to really think about and focus on the impact of economic sanctions in Iran on different sectors of society. And one of the areas, obviously, that it is impacting and that there's been so much of the social science literature or policy literature or public health literature sort of focuses in on questions of humanitarian crises under comprehensive economic sanctions, or questions of the impacts on particular economic and industrial sectors of society. But one of the things that we have much less of is the ways in which it really impacts both the everyday lives of people who live under prolonged sanctions regimes, as well as the sort of their life and the aspirations and the possibilities that then come with what the impacts of that sanctions have on multiple aspects of a society's life. So one of the areas that, which is your specialty and that we really wanted to get more insight on, was the ways in which sanctions impact the publishing world in Iran. So what are some of your major findings?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think because sanctions do affect these vital things, right? Access to medication, right? Like things that undergird people's sort of health and basic livelihood, it's very easy to overlook cultural goods, right? Which may seem like the cherry on the icing when you're struggling to make ends meet. Nevertheless, and sort of I make this argument sort of in this report, is like books are really vital to the vitality of a society, right? They're very important in setting conversations, especially in a place like Iran, in which they're still very popular, sort of in the mainstream media, right? Like book reviews, people know famous translators, they know famous authors, and so there's still a public intellectualism that tends to be shared, and so. Yeah, books are incredibly important still in the way ideas sort of move and flourish and get seen. And so, it's interesting because books and publishers often emphasize this, and this is, all across the social science literature, they're both commodities, right? And they're vessels for ideas. And we see them being affected then by sanctions, right? In the fact that they're good, right? Like they're a commodity that you can buy and sell. And part of their raw material is imported, right? And that being paper. They are affected by sanctions and the inflation that stems from sanctions, just like any other good. And so that may be the more obvious finding, right? Which is like books have become more expensive. And in order to make ends meet, publishers have had to resort to all various sorts of strategies to reduce their costs and increase their profits. So things like shortening the length of the book or publishing fewer new books, reprinting older books. So these strategies are interesting to study. I think they're less surprising. I think what's more surprising is thinking about sort of maybe the overlooked and even nefarious impacts that sanctions have had on the cultural sector more broadly, especially the relationships that have made it really tick until now. And I was really inspired, and if listeners or readers haven't seen, Arzu Osanlu's report in Iran Under Sanctions talks really, in really thought-provoking ways about the effect of sanctions on everyday relations. And a lot of that also echoed with my findings, but in this cultural sector.
So, one of the, as you say, like as cost of everything has gone up, the cost of the books have gone up, which then means that people are buying less and less of them. And then publishers are also making a decision about what kinds of books that they publish. I want to, and then towards the end, you mentioned the everyday impacts on the cultural sector and the ways in which you were inspired by Arzu Osanlu's work under the same series. Can you draw out that connection for us a little bit more, and then kind of show us, as you do in your report, how it's a feedback mechanism that then happens that sort of further entrenches both things that you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think they're slightly separate issues, but as you point out, right, they definitely interweave. So on the one hand, right, there are all different kinds of publishers in Iran, right? They're not like cut from a single cloth. And so there have always been publishers who've been more than happy to let simply the interest of readers or the market dictate their choices. But there have also been publishers who have tried to uphold certain ideals, whether they're driven by a certain like political ideology, or committed to sort of ensuring that certain ideas and genres are represented. And by this, I mean, right, there are, for instance, publishers who are really committed to translating and publishing, let's say, classic works like in the social sciences and humanities, right? So ranging, from things like from Plato and Aristotle to like Kant or more contemporary philosophers, right? This is not so much politically inclined as much as it is a commitment to a certain, like making certain texts available to Iranian readers. But I think the tricky thing for these publishers, and this is, this existed even long before sanctions, or long before sanctions really affected this sector, is that these books don't necessarily sell well. And so often they would balance the sale of these books with sort of more popular books. As publishers have been more hard pressed under sanctions, right, they can do less and less of these sort of projects. And oftentimes, right, these projects require like advances, right, to authors or translators that they're interested in getting on board. And they also, represent a commitment to a commodity that they know won't make them as much profit. And so many of these publishers have been pushed into sort of new genres or topics that they may previously have been a little more hesitant to publish. So there are a lot more books of like pop psychology, relationships, self-help, and a lot of, because those are often what sell, and a lot of publishers, are less than happy that they feel like their hand has been forced in this direction. So that's in terms of content. I think in terms of relationships, there's all other sorts of threads we can draw, which is that, this is the cultural sector, right? The intellectual and cultural sector of book publishing in Iran is not a very large community. Of course, there's, always younger translators or younger authors who are trying to break into the scene, but a lot of these relationships have been long-standing, right? So translators have worked with certain publishers for many years. Some of our family friends, they've had close-knit relationships. And these relationships are built on trust. And a lot of that trust revolves, not just around knowing someone, but also responsible financial payment and, right, a publisher's ability to ensure a quality commodity and, an effective just like distribution of that. And a lot of these things have been impacted by sanctions. So publishers, wittingly or unwittingly, willingly or unwillingly, right, have had to compromise on the material product that they're putting out. And this is something that authors and translators notice. If your book, sort of dissolves before your eyes, as a lot of these recently published books do, right, that might affect your willingness to go with the same publisher again. Or if you feel like your publisher isn't publishing in the quantity you would like to see your book published, right, that affects both, the number of eyes you can get on it, but also the money that you're making, right, since you're making a percentage of that. So, as publishers find themselves under duress, right, their relationships have begun to fray. And, there's also, right, the issue of pay, right? They've also been pushing sort of newer translators and authors to pay less and less. And so that really weakens, young people's ability to enter this sector, right? If they're not being paid or paid well for their services.
So, in your report, you talk about how, for example, authors or translators that have worked with a specific publisher for some time will see how their newest book, the cover image will just like basically erase really quickly, or just, the quality isn't good, or the papers come out in the final product. And one of the things that you're painting for us here in this report is that then it's kind of like you're showing us a picture of an industry that's beginning to crack. Now, one can say, or showing lots of fault lines in it, and kind of like from the inside. And, one can say, okay, Hosna, on an international scale, publishing houses are having a difficult time in this current, both economic moment that we're in, as well as what the internet brings to publishing. What is it that, are there differences between what you're seeing in Iran and this larger conversation around the economic, sort of downturn of the publishing industry?
I think there are differences, and the primary one, and maybe the one that I'm trying to get to, but not doing such a great job of sort of clearly spelling out, is that it's not simply that people are buying less books or that the books look less pretty, right? This is a problem, that could sort of cross national boundaries, since publishing is under duress in so many different places. The more sort of worrying or problematic issue is that sort of the bonds that hold this intellectual sector together are fraying, right? People, as people are being put under more economic duress, and I just don't mean companies, right? I mean individuals, right? The fact that they feel that they are often pressed into cutting corners of different kinds to make ends meet, means that their relationships are dissolving, right? And that's really dangerous for a sector that's built on trust, right? So I'll give you one example from the other end. And again, this report does focus more on the publishers, but we can also look at it, through the translators lens, which is, sort of how it's affecting translators. A really well-known translator, has had, like many others in the last recent years, financial difficulty. And in order to make ends meet, right, he's been taking on lots and lots of contracts with multiple publishing houses, more than he could feasibly, finish himself. He's been doling out to his students and then just putting the books together, right? So like he'll give a student one chapter and another chapter, another student another chapter, put it all together and return it to the publisher. Well, I mean, publishers can tell, right? Especially if they've had a long-standing relationship with the translator, sort of what's going on. And they're just less likely to work with that person, or they feel betrayed, or right. There's all sorts of sentiments, right, that affect then the working relationship, the ongoing working relationships here. And this is not an isolated case. So increasingly, right, people under economic duress are cornered into making sort of choices that, or maybe they're not choices, right, but into actions that then sort of defray their reputation. And a lot of the intellectual sector in Iran is built on people's reputations.
Right. So what you're explaining here is that economic sanctions are enacting a reputational cost, which is really the main currency, if you will, in the intellectual and knowledge creating sectors of a society, and that in it, as both the materiality of the books themselves get poorer and poorer over time, you're also showing us that the content itself, the quality of the content is also getting less and less over time because of what you're saying, having to have multiple people translate one book. And therefore it means that the voice that's being communicated, as well as then the editorial oversight, is not happening. So this then leads to one of the other things which you're talking about in this report, or that you really nod towards, which is intellectual expression, and how that has then therefore also been one of the, in addition to the reputational costs and the cutting or sort of defraying of trust relationships. So can you tell us more about this impact on intellectual expression and what that means and what those impacts are?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to give the wrong impression. There are many, many, many talented translators and authors still operating under these difficult circumstances today, right? And there are publishers that are still committed to getting their books out, even though it may take longer or there may be less copies in circulation. So, right, even though this sector is under duress, I don't want to paint a wholly negative picture of everyone involved. At the same time, right, it's exactly this, is that so many sacrifices have had to be made, right? So a publisher or translator, might have a book that they really feel strongly about. And I've seen this, right, in person. And yet they don't have the means or the time or someone willing to back them up in order to actually get that book translated and published. And so this means that books that they feel are truly valuable, or that they really want to make available to Iranian readers, right, they just can't. And a lot of those books collect dust until a later day, right, hoping that one day things will settle down and I'll be able to somehow get to this book. That happens especially with lengthier books or books that are really classics and would require a significant time commitment to translate. So previously, under better circumstances, publishers could offer translators advances, right? So they would say, this is a hefty tome, right? I want you to sit down for 2 years and sort of take a crack at this book. We think it's worth it. We think it's valuable, right? In terms of what it would, provide publics and readers and thought in Iran. That's really not happening anymore. And so, right, there is absolutely sort of an intellectual cost.
So what does this do in the things that you've been observing and researching about the circulation of ideas more broadly in Iran, both those in translation as well as those that are not in translation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it just, right, we tend to think of ideas as free-floating things, right? Things that sort of just move through the ether or move from my brain to your brain. And of course, conversation is important and ideas can have a power, right? At the same time, right, ideas are not completely inseparable or divisible from materiality, right? Even the conversation we're having is only being made possible by Zoom and YouTube, right? Which require servers and computers, right? So there's sort of material channels, right, that enable our communication, and books are a really important one. And so if you are publishing fewer books, shorter books, less serious books, right, there's multiple futures that are being cut off that are sort of impossible to sort of enumerate or capture because they're unknown futures. But I think we can appreciate that there's conversations that might never happen because there's so many books that just never are able to, be translated or disseminated in Iran today.
And, this also, you're focused in this report on the production end of this more, sort of more than on the circulation end. But the other thing that what you're looking at sort of relates to is that sanctions also isolate a society from international flows of not only of goods, obviously, and as you're pointing out, ideas are in a capitalist world a good that gets traded, but also with Iranian authors not being able to partake in book sort of major book conferences around the world, not just, I mean, because being sanctioned in the ways that they are, it's difficult to move across borders. B, it's really expensive, but C, there are also all of these actual barriers in the way of them being able to do so. So how does, I mean, it seems like what you are sort of pointing us to is the multiple layers of which ideas, the circulation of ideas become, I don't want to use the word trapped is not the right word, but their circulation gets like into smaller and smaller circles over time. How do you see this connection between both the isolation of the intellectual community in Iran, the writers, the scientists, the researchers who have a really difficult time publishing in international journals now, to this world that you are painting for us, which are extremely related to each other?
Yeah, I mean, I think you put it really, really well, right? Is that circulation has been impinged, right? Or is increasingly like narrow. Not that it doesn't exist, but I mean, I see this, yeah, and this may be a more mundane example, but ideas don't just come through books, obviously, but so much comes from in-person relationships. And so, some of the major publishers that I worked with used to attend like the Frankfurt Book Festival, like these big international book fairs. And they were really, really inspired by what they saw. So this is a sector that's been undergoing sort of increasing professionalization. And a lot of them, the opportunity to interface with these major publishers from other countries, French publishers, German, American, all of them, give them a lot of inspiration for how to like develop their own business models, or even like divide up their divisions within their companies, right? This has nothing to do with the content of books. This is also, but it has a lot to do with how the ideas about how to produce them. Right. These opportunities have been completely cut off, right? I can't even recall a publisher that went to a book fair as long as I've been doing this work, right? A lot of them had done it in the past, but not since 2012. Maybe they have, I don't know of any. And this is right. This is obviously something that we see reflected in all other kinds of disciplines. Absolutely. I also think, it's a different time. So again, I don't know if this is like a silver lining of globalization or whatnot. A big issue, like maybe 2 decades ago, was actually getting your hands on books. So because Iranians often, right, didn't have easy networks of travel, right, even before like the more recent sanctions, they were often reliant on their friends or relatives to like mail them books they were interested in, right? A lot of them would be like subscribed to catalogs. Let's say like Harvard University Press, right? They'd subscribe to the catalog, and a book would catch their eye, and they'd sort of have to like beg around to friends and family, like, can you send me a copy of this book? With the advent of sort of these Russian pirating sites, Iranians have actually a lot easier access to books that they want to peruse for translation. And so ironically, at this moment where there's been closure of sort of the ability of bodies to move across borders, there's been an increasing sort of access to pirated printed material. But it doesn't necessarily make up for conversations or what other forms of engagement.
Yeah, and that leads to another question, which is okay, so as the materiality of books become more difficult and more expensive, can't people just read online or ebooks?
Yeah.
Or what I've seen a lot of is people will send things to each other on Telegram, right? Even PDFs of whole books, though not always in translation, obviously, just like the original language. Yeah. But nonetheless, how does that world interact with what you are finding?
Yeah, in really interesting ways. So I think, so obviously, right, ebooks and stuff can be a threat to Iranian publishing. At the same time, I think there's multiple layers to this. One is that Iranians love books, right? As a commodity, right? They are a beloved object, right? Like they're often displayed in homes. Public libraries are not really a thing in Iran. I mean, they do exist, but they're not circulating libraries, meaning like you can't really check out a book. The books are just for use while you're in the library. And they don't have a large range of books. So they're not going to bring in recent books are bestsellers, right? Whatever's in a library is pretty stagnant. So a long-standing tradition among scholars, both religious and secular, is having very extensive home libraries. And so books are not just, books are a form of social cachet, I would say. And so, a lot of times my interlocutors would, make fun of people who like bought these like hefty tomes of philosophy and they say they never read them, they just want to display them. But regardless, right, they're a marker of social and cultural capital. So I think there's something about the material commodity of the book that still matters to Iranians. And of course, right, like research on this in the US has found that, a good number of people still prefer to read hard copies to any digital copy. So that's on one end. The second is that e-readers have not quite taken off in Iran the same way that they have in the US. And even in the US, right, the reach is limited to certain genres, right, or certain like groups. So there are interesting companies doing work, like if listeners are interested or viewers are interested, Fidibo, Fidibo, they're one of the companies that's making sort of more headway into the ebook space legally, right? So you can buy an ebook, and they've developed a fairly good app for iOS and Android platforms where you can purchase. Well, we can't because they're not on US credit card, but Iranian readers within Iran can purchase using their debit cards. And right, we do see this large circulation of free or illegal PDFs on the internet, right? Things like WhatsApp and Telegram and whatnot. But what's interesting is that if people are really committed to reading those, often they'll still go print them off at a copier's, right? So there's something I think about the page, and I've seen Iranians do this, right? Where they like, I got this book sent to me legally, it's not censored, I'm gonna go like print it off at the copy shop. So there's still something about the materiality of the book that's important to Iranians, and that just drives us right back into like issues with the cost of paper. I don't know if that quite answers your
yeah, no,
question.
It definitely does. And one of the other things that it especially in your discussion of the cost of paper in here, what struck me so much, given the type of research I did, is that the publishers that belong in the pro-regime world continue to get very highly subsidized paper.
Yeah.
Right. And so this is also creating further imbalances, like beyond the question of censorship and things like that, which is the pro-regime publishing world, which is also quite extensive, is obviously being hit, but it's not being hit at all in the same way as the more independent publishing world. Would you agree with that? And also, what are some of the potential repercussions?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think the reason it's non-relevant in some ways to the findings of this report, or the kinds of people that I was speaking with, is that they don't compete for the same audience, really, right? Yeah. So pro-regime books are going to sort of different kinds of places, sort of geographically, in terms of they're circulating in different bookstores, they're going, maybe to different towns, right? Like, so part of it is that they're not quite competing for the same audience. Right, so there's like a limited readership of books of social science, and they're discerning enough, right? So there's a few private publishing houses that Iranian readers who are interested in these kinds of topics, know and trust, and so they're not likely to confuse the two. I think one major problem, and I have to say I have not observed this myself because I haven't done enough ethnographic work in the past 2 years, but that I've heard from many people that I've spoken to. One of the biggest threats to this private publishing industry, though, comes from pirated books, and I do talk about this in the report, which is basically printers who manage to get hold, either they're photocopying, but more likely they're managing to get hold of like the PDF of a book that's sent to a publishing house, right? Like whatever goes to the typesetter, and they're republishing it, or reprinting it, I should say, right? They're not even quite publishing, under a different cover at a much lower cost and selling it on the streets. And this actually is something that almost every publisher that I spoke to in the past 2 summers has started complaining about. And this is entirely new from like 2014. Right? This industry did not really exist in 2014. And this is actually a much more significant threat because it's the same translator, it's the same exact book, right? And a reader can purchase it for like, 30,000 tomon versus 120,000. And they don't have a lot of incentive to buy the $120,000 tomon copy, except, right, maybe they're, I don't know, like maybe they have money to throw around, which most people don't these days. And for the printer who's printing it, this is almost pure profit, right? They're only paying for the paper, but they don't have to pay editing costs, typesetting costs, author's advance. And they tend to split like with the bookseller, like the street seller, like 30-70, right? So they can afford to be fairly generous. And this is something that many private publishers were complaining about, much more so than sort of ebooks, or ebooks, legal ebooks are a different matter. But I mean, even like, illegally circulating PDFs is like this is much more of a direct threat to their livelihood.
So just like in a lot of other sectors, part of the after effects of sanctions are that it produces new markets, right? That are oftentimes sort of
absolutely
the black market of the things that were produced in non-sanctions times in a different way. And this is the money that's now circulating on these black and gray markets is creating whole new social classes and whole new social sort of relations that are upending the ones that existed before. Would you say that
absolutely.
You see the same thing in the book world? Okay.
Oh, absolutely. And again, this is not work that, not anything I've directly observed, but, interlocutors I've spoken to say like part of what's really tricky about this black market of books, and absolutely is a black market, because even though Iran doesn't abide by international copyright issues, there's definitely internal copyright law. So this is certainly a black market. Is that the Minister of Culture and Guidance tends to turn a blind eye for whatever reason, right? So interpret that as you may, but part of the reason that publishers are struggling so hard is that there's really been a lack of willingness to sort of crack down on this market as well. Yeah, so absolutely.
In the conclusion of your report, you write that the materiality of books cannot be disentangled from the public that forms around them. As the materiality and reach of books suffer under sanctions, this affects the ability of publics to convene around ideas that they might otherwise propagate. Thus, one of the major ironies of sanctions is that they have weakened a significant avenue for the dissemination and circulation of ideas, including ones that might help support democratic movements in Iran, one of the proverbial goals of the Western powers that enforce those sanctions. Unpack this for us.
Yeah, so I mean, I feel weird about saying this because it sounds like I'm supporting sanctions. I'm absolutely not. I hope that's obvious. But many of the time, right, actions like sanctions are considered to be like, I mean, they're not. They're absolutely, I think, another form of warfare, but they are considered, right, on the surface to be a form of soft power. And another form of soft power, historically, that the U.S. is engaged in is cultural diplomacy. And I'm thinking back to things like the Franklin Book Project, which was this international project, funded by the U.S. government in during the Cold War era, in which they supported the publishing industry in multiple third world countries, including Iran. So Egypt had like a branch of the Franklin Book Project, and so did Iran. And Iran's might be the most famous because it was the most successful, right? It became independent. It produced profit independently of sort of the U.S. input. And the goal of the Franklin Book Project was really to support the publication and dissemination of books that might make Iranians more sympathetic to sort of democratic and capitalist forms of government or economic regimes rather than the Soviet model. And some of this, it was like things like novels and social science books. And one of the other great ironies of the Franklin Book Project is that Iran was spearheaded by a bunch of leftists and ended up publishing all sorts of interesting things. But that's another story. But part of what I'm just suggesting is to say that, right, alongside sanctions, right, there is this like proverbial push for like democratic, liberal theories and arguments to take foothold in Iran. And we saw this like with the Green Movement and the Arab Movement, right, which is sort of these US media would say like, oh, like here they are like implementing like Gene Sharp's 98 steps. Here they are like taking our ideas seriously. And I think, yeah, one of the goals of sanctions is to put people under duress, right? And then hope that like a democratic spark alights and that people, suddenly like see the light of liberalism and rise up against their dictatorial regimes. Right? I think this is a narrative that we can all recognize. And I think one of the great ironies of sanctions is that it prevents, right, all these interesting discussions and debates from happening, as we've discussed, when sort of ideas and books become increasingly sort of limited, both in terms of topic and also in terms of reach, right? Like, 300 copies is not 2,000 copies, right? That's just, maybe
so one of the
things passing, but it's just less people who are encountering those ideas on a page. And this is not to suggest that I think those books could actually bring about a democratic revolution that the US wants. It's just, ironic that it even impinges like their own, potential model for change.
So one of the things that I'm hearing in what you're saying is that economic sanctions is not just pinching people's purses for everyday goods and needs, although that is also a very important impact that they have, which is to shrink bread baskets, to cause folks to not have access to the types of medicines that they need for acute illnesses in a place like Iran. But also, as it constricts the circulation of ideas, what it's doing is it's not only sapping the everyday economic muscle of people, but it's also in many ways really sapping even the potential circulation of ideas about what a future society or what a current society, or just like those things become less and less under long form economic sanctions. And as that becomes less, that has real consequences to even the possibilities and potentialities of politics moving forward.
Absolutely, right. And this isn't just me saying like people can afford to buy less books. It's saying, right, like I love the way you put it, right? It's the potentialities for, like creative thought about what might come next, right? And I think about this like in terms of, like, I'll give you a small example, right? So there used to be a bookstore near my grandmother's house that I used to go, that I'd sort of been to since I first started going to Iran more regularly at the age of 18. And it had like classes, it was a bookstore connected to a publishing house, and the publisher offered sort of classes, informal, so not, just people would stop by, on novels or more philosophical texts sort of every Friday. And it really flourished during Khatami's presidency, and it sort of hung on, like sort of meandered throughout Ahmadinejad. But with sort of the increased sanctions, the publisher went under duress, the bookstore was sold, right? And these conversations completely ceased, right? And that's just a small example of something that I think has echoed across this sector. And as people are put under duress, including intellectual producers, right, they just have less bandwidth to actually engage in intellectual thinking, right? Like if you're so consumed with like paper and ink and just like making your business last until like the next quarter, right, that's so much less bandwidth that you have for thinking about, like what kind of like book series can I produce that might really inspire people to think about art or music or literature. So yeah, absolutely. I think both in terms of interpersonal relationships and in terms of, people's ability really to think about things that are beyond survival, right? It's really been impacted severely in this sector, including in so many other aspects of people's everyday lives.
I mean, it paints such a bleak picture, Go ahead. Yeah.
So I would say yes, but this is obviously not the only sector where thought happens, right? I am talking about sort of one economic sector. It's an important one. And I mean, I try to make the case of why it's so important, but I also wonder,
but I think what you're
with
doing,
everything that happened in the fall, right? If there's other avenues, there might be other avenues for ideas that we don't see yet, right? And I hope that's the case, right? If we want to stay hopeful about the situation. But I do agree, it's fairly bleak.
Well, I mean, and I don't, for me, it's more like what your research is showing us is the repercussions of this in this particular sector. But as we're seeing from all of the reports coming out of Iran under sanctions, is that there are similar trends. They look different in different sectors, right? But there are similar trends like cascading. It's like a, yeah. I mean, one of the things that I wrote down as I was rereading your report is it's a chain effect, right? So like everything is a chain effect, because in any industry there is a linkage of people from the very top to the right, like depending on whatever the industry is. And so sanctions, obviously, because it contracts so heavily, especially in such prolonged sanctions regimes, the longer it goes on, the more that this effect down the chain of that industry begins to strain. And so, yes, you know, you're showing this to us in the book publishing world, but in the television world, it's a different kind of thing, but it happens. In the filmmaking world, it's different, but it happens. And the all of the, I mean, you're talking about like September uprisings and stuff. The types of ideas that circulate on social media end up, the repercussions of it are different, but yet still, like, you can still see similar kinds of trends. And I think that that's one of the things that folks who look at sanctions, because the literature has focused so much on the policy end of this conversation for so long, and the like how the implementation of it works, that beyond some of the key economic indicators of like heightened inflation, or things like that, or some of the heightened humanitarian disasters of sanctions in different countries around the world, those are the things we focus on. But one of the things that I think your work and others is showing us is that it literally has an impact on every single person in a society. For some, it's positive, those connected to certain sectors of society, right? They're becoming richer and richer. But for most, it's a very negative thing that's happening. And it has repercussions not only in their day-to-day, what they can buy and what they can eat, but in how they're thinking about things and the types of people they're relating to. And I think that's one of the things that you did a really brilliant job of, like, showing us in this one industry, look at what it's doing in this time period. And it allows us to then imagine out from that.
I mean, that's really lovely of you to say. And I'm so glad that you felt that way. And I do have to say, I agree. This sort of the way sanctions begin to degrade sort of people's ability to think beyond like their next paycheck, right? Or how to make ends meet, is really disheartening. And I agree. Like, in writing this, I obviously reviewed like the other sanctions reports. And at some point I was like, am I just stating the obvious? Because it's the same pattern, of course, in new and different ways, right? It has different effects in this sector. But I think, anytime you're making a vast swath of the population increasingly concerned about, again, like making ends meet, that's just so much less breathing room for, like culture, activity, like relationship building, right? All of these things that we engage in and find meaning in as humans, right? And so I do think it does really dehumanize people, right? Like our ability to think creatively and intellectually is possibly what distinguishes our species from others. And so, right, if you're taking that away from people, then right, it does go to a very sort of disheartening and dangerous place, I would say, right? People end up feeling like they have nothing to lose, which is something, that we've seen like young people in Iran increasingly express.
There's a couple of questions from the audience that I want to ask of you, Hosna. So, one person is asking how can they get a copy of Dr. Sheikholeslami's report. Our team will put the link in, but it's on our website, which is rethinkingiran.com, and you can go under the Iran under sanctions and you'll see her report. It's the top one right now because it was just published. Another person, audience member, Hosna, is asking, besides the material cost impacts that you've discussed, do sanctions prevent publishing houses from even being able to access rights to works produced in the West?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it's, just because of length, it's one that I don't really get into in this report. But Iran does not abide by any international copyright treaties. So there's a few that sort of govern sort of the world of books, right? Like, Iran's not a signatory to the WIPO or sort of the Berne Agreement, which was, this agreement that you would, give people credit. So Iranians do not have an issue in terms of legally, right? Domestically. They don't have an issue when it comes to translating books that are published elsewhere. And this book gives them a lot of freedom. It's one reason translations are so important in Iran, because they're actually cheaper to produce than original authored works, right? But it also creates its own whole host of problems that I write a lot about elsewhere, but don't get into in this piece. It's not directly relevant because so typically what would happen, right? Let's say there's a book is published in the US and an Italian publisher wants to publish it. They will sign a contract, right? So a percentage of the translation that's published in Italy will be paid back to the original publisher and author. And there will only be one translation of that book, right? Especially if it's a book that's obviously still under copyright. Because Iran doesn't abide by international sanctions, right? And this has happened, right? So let's say a book comes out in the US. I'm trying to think of a popular book this past year. I don't know if you have one, Nagus, like, I don't know, let's say like Behave.
Michelle Obama's The Light We Carry.
Oh, there we go. Michelle Obama, there we go. I
they
just
always love
so I have like
translating her.
like book references currently. Yeah, Michelle Obama's Becoming. Is that what it's called? Becoming.
The Light We Carry.
The Light We Carry. So I even got the name wrong, title wrong. There is a mad rush on the part of Iranian publishers and translators to be the first one to publish this, because again, no one has the official rights. No one is paying Obama, Michelle for her work. So you'll have like 10 translations come out like within 2 months. And then some are terrible, some might be great, but readers kind of have to sift through them. But it's also one reason certain publishing houses have such incredible reputations, right? Because they maintain higher standards for those translations. So, readers might feel like I can trust, Noor Publishing House because I know that they don't translate like terrible translations, of which, there might be many of the same book. I hope that helps explain a bit.
Yeah. And that's why, again, to kind of make the point for the listeners to your earlier point, Hosna, is that when then the translators, because they're under economic duress, take on more projects and then give different chapters of the things that they take on to their different students or people who work with them, then the finished product is not of the same quality that publishing house or that translator usually does. And then over time, it begins to the audience or the readers begin to lose confidence and lose trust in these publishing houses and in these translators, and then stop buying. Right? Like this is what you were talking about before.
That's absolutely right. And thank you for making that connection. Absolutely. So when I said, these things are reputation based, I meant it like, on a very literal and financial level. And so, and it could be cut off at the stage of the readers or at the stage of the publisher, right? So if a publisher is working with a translator and keeps getting terrible manuscripts, at some point they just say like, we're not commissioning works from you anymore. And oftentimes those are long-standing, even friendships that have formed. And so there's increasing distrust on all levels of the publishing sector, ranging from like the printer to, the translator to the editor. And again, like the rise of black market books has even complicated this, because now people don't even trust their own editors, because the editor might go and sell the PDF of a book for a nice sum to a black market publisher. So, it's been fairly disheartening to see like how relationships have frayed over the past 10 years.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that Omar Dawashi, the Iraqi scholar, writes about in his work on sanctions on Iraq, is one of the biggest impacts that it has is on decaying of social relations over time, and creating new forms of social bonds that are really based on not trust, and that has huge ramifications for society, right? And you're showing us how that happens on the scale of one industry, and I'm sure your book and your other writing goes even more in depth than this report. But again, I think taking all of the research that's being done right now for Iran under sanctions and other places more holistically, we kind of see exactly what Dawashi was talking about in relation to Iraq, beginning to really have an impact on social relations in Iran.
Yeah, and in some ways, right, for me, as an observer, it's the most worrisome impact, right? Because things like price or like number of books in circulation are things, they're malleable, right? They're changeable. You can recover from under sort of different economic conditions, but you can't rebuild trust ties or social relations that have been broken, right? You can't hit undo, right? Once you've hurt someone deeply, as has happened, commonly in this industry.
So what we see happening in Iran is not only social relations being strayed because of political pressures and political repression, but also being frayed because of the impacts of economic sanctions. Hosna, thank you so much. This is really, really fruitful.
Thank you for having me.
You've given us so much to think about. And again, I think, this idea of like, we need to pay attention to the circulation of ideas. We need to pay attention to what kinds of potential futures we're all even thinking about and what's being circulated. And it's really difficult and to do that in these kinds of settings that we're in. But you're pointing us to what's going on in this world. And I really appreciate your research and you writing all of this out.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you so much for those of you who are watching or listening for joining us today.
Yeah. Everyone, make sure we'll also be posting when Hosna's book comes out in the future and all of that. But look out for her work. It's really she's doing some work that we don't have much of, especially in the Iran space. So thanks so much again for joining us, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll see you all next time.